I'm Michelle Major. I'm on the faculty at the BGC, and on behalf of the director, the dean, and my three co-conveners, I'm very happy to welcome you to this evening's lecture in the Modern Design History Seminar Series, which, if I'm doing the math right, is now officially in its 8th year. I'm especially pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Louise Purbrick, who is a principal lecturer in the history of art and design at the University of Brighton. She received her PhD in art history from the University of Sussex in 1993. And before joining the faculty at Brighton, Dr. Purbrick was a lecturer at Manchester Metropolitan University, Winchester School of Art, and the University of Portsmouth, where she taught art and design history and media and design. Her book publications include The Great Exhibition of 1851, Manchester University Press 2001, The Wedding Present, Domestic Life Beyond Consumption, Ashgate 2007, and Contested Spaces, Sites, Histories and Representations, Palgrave 2007. She has also published numerous articles related to these and other subjects in edited volumes including Love Objects, Emotion, Design, and Material Culture, Bloomsbury 2014, The Politics of Cultural Memory, Cambridge Scholars Press 2010, and Gender, Civic Culture and Consumerism, Middle Class Identity in Britain, 1800 to 1940, Manchester University Press, 1999. Her work has appeared in many scholarly journals, including the Journal of Latin American Cultural Studies, the Journal of War and Culture Studies, and the Journal of Design History. Dr. Purbrick's research emphasizes an understanding of materiality and visuality and focuses on sites of conflict and imprisonment, the spaces of industrial exploitation and exhibition, the art of political struggle and the attachments to domestic possessions in everyday life, and the ways in which the past remains present in its material forms. She has a long-standing interest in the long Kesh Maze prison site, the subject of tonight's talk, the now empty icon of the Troubles located 10 miles south of Belfast, and she has spent many years documenting the transformation of its cell units known as the HBlocks. Dr. Purbrick often works in collaboration with activists, archaeologists, artists, community groups, and photographers. Most recently, she was part of the Traces of Nitrate, Mining History and Photography Between Britain and Chile project, an interpretation of the abandoned architecture of mining in the Atacama Desert in northern Chile, and the legacies of the nitrate trade in Britain, and her work on this is in publication. She is a member of the Remaking Picasso's Guernica Collective and has worked with Healing Through Remembering on exhibition projects. In 2010, Brighton Museum and Art Galleries accessioned a collection from which she curated Rattling the Cage, which was held in 2009. A community archive of documents, textiles, photography, and film used in a campaign to free a Guantanamo detainee. Most recently, she worked with the Community University Partnership Program on art, refuge, and resistance, an exhibition of documents and designs about the current conditions of refugees. In 2012, at the Design History Conference in Brighton, the theme of which was the material culture of sport, Dr. Purbrick gave a paper entitled, Who Wants to Play Football on the Rubble of the HBlocks? And I was really very drawn in and moved by her talk, in part because it was something about which I knew virtually nothing, but also because of her nuanced analysis of and great sensitivity to the highly complex issues surrounding this notorious prison and its prisoners and its history and its legacy. So I'm really looking forward to tonight's exploration of another aspect of the Long Kesh Maze, entitled Keys to the HBlocks, the Materiality of Conflict and Imprisonment in Northern Ireland, which deals with the eBay auction of objects associated with the prison and their circulation in everyday life and a domestic economy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Louise Purbrick.
Such a nice introduction. I've forgotten
I got a lot from you.
I've forgotten I've done a lot of those things, so thanks for reminding me. And also I'd really like to thank Bard for welcoming me tonight, and particularly Michelle and Laura, without whom I wouldn't be here actually. All my possessions would be scattered along the highway, so she's helped me get here intact, so thank you very much. Okay, so to begin. So on eBay, which was the melodious critique of the sale of looted antiques from Iraq, which we were just listening to as we were settling down, was released by an anarcho-punk folk band called Chumbawamba in 2004. And you might not have heard the lyrics, but in the second verse it goes, "In old Baghdad, they're dusting off the antiques. It's the 14th Guernica we've had this week." Guernica, both bomb site and artwork, is on eBay is one of the song's lyrical layers of multiple meanings. Its deceptively simple repeating refrain, which you might have heard, "Babylon, back to Babylon," is a reference to the ancient city, to contemporary Iraq, to past and present. And it's also sung as a metaphor for decadence and corruption. And so that easy sing-song rhythm, "Babylon, back to Babylon," captures the cycle of goods that to and fro across the world with the click of a key on an internet auction site. So "Babylon, back to Babylon" is a description of the commodity exchanges of a second-hand market. So the band, Chumbawamba, they're from Leeds actually, and have only just stopped playing after 30 years, which is a shame. But anyway, so Chumbawamba, their wry observation that any artefact, no matter how revered, ends up just as stuff you can buy, could be made of the sale of material culture associated with the Prism, Long Kesh maze, that is the subject of this paper. So on September the 21st, 2010, a seller on eBay who called himself Big Balls from the Falls listed a collection of keys from the HBlocks of Long Kesh maze and one of its security cameras. He, and I am assuming it's a he because of his chosen ID, he presented himself as a representative of the Catholic nationalist community of West Belfast, through which the Falls Road is the main route. He priced this key collection, which comprises 80 pieces there or thereabouts, 23 keys, 57 key tags to cells, catwalks to grills, to switch and control rooms for HBlocks H1, H2, H4, H6 at £3,499. £499, so 1 penny short of £3,500. On the 30th of September, his listing ended early, which is a very typical of a strategy of an offline deal, and the security camera, which we looked at, sold for almost £400, £375, just 2 days after it was put up for auction. So, something about the HBlocks. The HBlocks were the cell units of the prison officially called Her Majesty's Prison Maze, but also known as Long Kesh by most of its prisoners. There are 8, and you can see them here, you can just make them out, is 8 flat-roofed, single-storey concrete structures built to this H-shaped floor plan, and they're built on fairly low-lying boggy land south of Belfast. And these blocks housed, in the words of one of Her Majesty's Inspectors of Prisons, Sir Hennessy, they house the largest concentration of terrorists in Western Europe. Terrorists, of course, is very contested, and that's the term that was used in 1984 to describe the prison population. The HBlocks remain one of the most important sites of conflict in Ireland. And the life of the prison corresponds to a period of conflict that is euphemistically referred to as the Troubles, which has spanned 30 years from August 1969 to the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, now almost 20 years ago in 1998. And a faltering and rather hesitant peace process has continued until today, so until the early 21st century. The conflict, according to one of its most respected analysts, is called by far the worst scene in Western Europe since the Second World War. And when I read that, I kind of feel that's sometimes wrong because it doesn't look, because you have to remember that Bosnia is in Eastern Europe, or classified in Eastern Europe. So, but for Western Europe, it still remains the worst conflict. And that conflict and Northern Ireland has been extensively interpreted according to McGarry and O'Leary. And that interpretation, in fact, has led to increased academic debate and discussion, I think. So there's agreement about the death toll. The numbers of deaths have been annotated and recorded at the time and now. So the death toll is 1,665 people, but there's no agreement about almost anything else. And there remains what sociologists and political scientists would call a conflict about what the conflict is about. A series of multiple disagreements could be kind of broadly divided into two camps, and those that describe the conflict as ethno-national and those that see the conflict as colonial in nature. And I'll just spend a little bit of time just talking about those two interpretations because I think it helps position some of the debates that we might want to take part in later. So currently I'd say ethno-national interpretations posit differences of culture and identity between two communities as the cause of conflict. So on the one hand there's loyalists, unionists and Protestants, and on the other Republicans, nationalists and Catholics. And that model has become the dominant one in political and public arenas, not least because the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, which it didn't bring about the ceasefires, they were 2 years before that, but they organised a period of transition, which arguably Northern Ireland is still in, and a devolved government and a series of arrangements including the release of prisoners from Long Kesh maze. But that agreement would be termed consociational in the sense that it allocates positions within the government and on working groups and in almost every department to communities. And so in some ways it entrenches opposition, so it entrenches that explanation of the conflict in politics now. So it appears dominant because it's practiced, I suppose, it's the practiced solution. However, you could argue that a war over territory, so the existence of Northern Ireland as part of the UK since partition in the 1920s, has been transformed into one of identity, so territory becomes identity. And colonial interpretations are those that seek to reinstate a history of colonial and British intervention in Ireland, emphasising the maintenance of Northern Ireland within the British state as a limited theatre of war between those seeking Irish independence, so nationalists and Republicans, and British forces. So the two explanations actually have two different sets of protagonists in the same war. So an interpretation of the conflict is not only a matter of academic or political debate, but it's manifested in material culture. And importantly, I would suggest that an examination of material culture does not reproduce the history of those entrenched oppositions. So I would suggest it's another way, and perhaps another way of reflecting upon the war through its material culture. So if we just take the price, a very brutal financial indicator of value, the keys to the HBlocks at £3,500, give or take a penny, are very highly valued. And just that alone, you kind of think that's quite interesting as a way of thinking about the conflict. So they're just bits of metal, and without any historical connections would be scrapped without a second thought. However, their past appears in their material form. They do appear somehow, at least to the person who paid all that money, agents of history. Now, they're not much to look at, but they have some kind of indexical properties that Alfred Schell would attribute to artworks. So some kind of, I want to suggest, some kind of secondary agency or primary agency even. Also, as keys, they can share some of the competencies that are associated with the technical objects that Bruno Latour and John Law configure in their accounts of actor network theory. So I'm suggesting that we might want to think of these as anthropological, or we might want to think of these as technical objects. Now, my paper is an attempt to unlock, if you can forgive the play on words, the meaning of the HBlock keys. The history to which they belong may seem here in New York in 2016 rather remote, but I'd like to offer two reasons for joining me in a kind of journey through these material forms of conflict. So first, one of my reasons for hoping that you might participate in this history with me. In a 2012 Irish Independent article about the war in Syria, Patrick Coburn, so I don't know if he's read here, but he's a very highly respected Middle East correspondent, he reminded his readers of the Irish independence of a politics of the last atrocity. And that term was used throughout the conflict or the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And he defines it as when the latest act of violence and the retaliation it provokes dictates the direction of day-to-day policies. So Patrick Cockburn makes this as a plea to understand a longer history and the wider context for acts of violence or acts of war, rather than just simply to react or to repeat them. So in some ways my paper is about a kind of answer to a politics of last atrocity. So placing objects in their context, that kind of project of looking at things in their deeper context, is often the empirical endeavour of art and design historians such as ourselves. And we are usually really privileged to examine objects in which these aspirations, modern aspirations of the careful combination of form and function and the useful and the beautiful are realised. But in difficult times, maybe our practice should move beyond simple contextualisation to the recognition of significance, and could be or should be devoted to some of our most difficult objects. So I'm kind of arguing that some of our skills and practices we can apply to these objects, such as the HBlock keys, in ways that historians trained in other disciplines maybe don't attend to those details or to those meanings. Secondly, I'd say that the keys to the HBlocks, although they're very peripheral things from maybe a remote history, they're an exemplary case of how everyday things are material forms of the past. So these keys, I think, are a contradictory bundle of mundane materiality and almost overwhelming meaning. So they're highly charged, and they provide, I hope, some insights into the material relationships between people and objects, between person and things. And the art and design historical endeavour, I also, like many people here, I kind of appeal to anthropological analysis that does not necessarily always accept the arbitrary divisions between humanity and materiality. So by I kind of appealing to Gell or Bruno Latour, I'm also trying to look at the blurred differences between objects and humans and between people and things. And I can't really find many other explanations for why these bits of metal are so important unless we begin to think about notions of their human history and how they may contain that. So my paper will conclude with some reflections on material forms and human history, and I'll do a very brief rereading of Latour and Law's actor network theory. But I'd like to strike a note of caution even before I get to the end, is that I'm not sure that any prison is a network, with all that applies for sort of horizontal arrangements of mutual relationships between different kinds of materialities or actants in Bruno Latour's term. So prisons are hierarchies of power, and only networks, I'd say, insofar as they are systems. So Long Kesh Maze, the prison that we've been looking at, housed between 1971 and 2000 a large number of male prisoners suspended or sentenced for conflict-related offences. So it's as many as 10,000 went through the jail, not at any one time, but that's the number that went through. And Northern Ireland is quite a small place, and one of the figures around imprisonment was that 1 in 8 people were imprisoned if you took it as a percentage of the population. So the population is about the size of Liverpool, so if you're thinking about 10,000 people moving through a particular jail, it's a relatively small space and relatively, compared to the southeast where I live, not densely populated. So 10,000 men who were both Republicans and Loyalists and were both interned and sentenced at different times. So the first prisoners were internees. And internment's used several times in Northern Ireland's history, and it was reintroduced by a Stormont government on the 9th of August 1971. And Nissen huts, which we're seeing here, photographed well after the prison had shut. The Nissen huts were erected on the runways of Long Kesh Air Base, so a defence site, earlier in the year, so earlier than August 71, in preparation for mass arrests. So at the beginning of 1972, the Long Kesh Internment Centre, so this is how it began, comprised just 5 compounds, so 4 Nissen huts inside wire. And then Long Kesh was renamed Her Majesty's Prison Maze with the introduction of British direct rule in 1972, and it continued to grow until there were 22 compounds at the end of 1974. So over this time, so for the most part these are internees, which is administrative detention. There's no formal judicial process. So over this time, sentenced prisoners who had been through a court process began to be allocated compounds alongside internees. So it's a strange prison in a way, so it had sentenced prisoners and unsentenced prisoners in the same space. Now, some of the sentenced prisoners had a status which was called special category status, which the then Northern Ireland Secretary Willie Whitelaw had allowed. So there had been a hunger strike in Crumlin Road Jail, which is in Belfast, where Republican prisoners, who described themselves then as politically motivated prisoners, they refused to wear a uniform and take up work, and they won that hunger strike. And therefore, a special category for all those prisoners who had conflict-related offences was quite separate to what the nickname was ordinary decent criminals, ODCs. So there was a kind of, they had a different status, which was that they would have more letters and parcels, no uniform and no prison work. So essentially, and this was important, is that special category prisoners had more or less the same rights as those people who are on remand, so unsentenced, and interned unsentenced. So they're treated within the jail as if they're not in fact convicted, even though they have had a court process. So imprisonment was a strategy of war in Northern Ireland, as in conflicts all over the world. However, conflicts that take place within contemporary democracies often subvert existing judicial systems and penal systems to criminalise types of organisation or forms of expression or acts of violence that might, on a conventional battlefield, earn the status of a prisoner of war. So there's lots of kind of dualities that go on. Is that prisoners appear not to be sentenced, but in fact they're going through a criminal system that they're criminalising certain kinds of political acts. So, 1973, there was the Northern Ireland Emergency Provisions Act, and that lasted throughout the conflict, and it contained a schedule that codified a conflict-related offence, which included producing explosives, using firearms, holding weapons, making petrol bombs, throwing them, and membership of prescribed organisations. So there's a gamut of offences under that one legislation. There were trials for scheduled offences, but these were conducted in a court without a jury, which was named after Lord Diplock, who chaired the commission that recommended such a thing. So these Diplock courts allowed convictions on uncorroborated confessions, and it led to, quite famously, Supergrass trials in the 1980s. So successive British administrations found it politically expedient to define the conflict over Northern Ireland as a problem of law and order, and to consider violence as criminal or pathological even, rather than political. So both internment, which is always understood as a war measure, and special category, which is recognition of the political nature of political affiliations or violent acts, was rather compromising for a British government position, and it caused a significant embarrassment to phase out internment and withdraw special category status. So, those sentenced after March the 1st, 1976 were sent to newly, hastily constructed prison adjacent to the internment centre. So in this diagram you can see to the right hand side the Nissen huts. If you can see those kind of 4 rows, they look like tubes, and then the HBlocks on the side. So it now becomes a jail that has 2 separate systems. So the HBlocks were built to install a conventional penal regime of rehabilitation for individual male occupants based on a cellular structure. So the Nissen huts were collective, so they were kind of open spaces. They housed about 40 people, and they operated rather like a prisoner of war camp. And the HBlocks were to institute a so-called normal prison regime. So this was their function. 96 single units were divided into 4 wings, and each formed the upright of an H shape. The HBlocks, however, did not, in fact, contribute to normalisation. That was the phrase. It became a site of resistance to the depoliticisation of conflict, and in fact a front line in its own right. So the first Republican prisoners that were sent to the HBlock sought to win back special category status that had been withdrawn, and they refused to wear prison uniforms. So their action, which was known as being on the blanket, because when they were denied their own clothes they wrapped themselves in cell bedding, developed into a long, large-scale collective prison protest that escalated into a no-wash campaign in which prisoners refused to use bathrooms and to slop out. And ultimately it led to hunger strikes in 1981 and 1980 and 1981. So the blanket protest lasted from 76 until 81, so it's probably one of the longest large-scale collective prison protests in kind of 20th century history. 10 Republican prisoners over the summer of 1981 died from starvation, and the first and most well known was Bobby Sands, and at the time he was elected MP, so he died while he was elected MP to Parliament. He didn't take up his seat obviously, but he was MP for Fermanagh and Tyrone. And so these are the kinds of images. So these were 2 blanket men. It was a photograph that was smuggled out on the blanket and wrapped in a blanket, and these were some of the memorials that were produced for Bobby Sands. And here is the ways in which the H then becomes almost a cross-like. There's some religious symbolism and political symbolism that's mixed up in these. So the deaths of the hunger strikers, and this is New York, I found this today, so I thought people might want to have a look at that one. And this I also found today on eBay, so I thought I might include this. So the H shape becomes a symbol of the hunger strikes. So the shapes of those of dead hunger strikers embody the shapes of the jail, as you can see. Okay. So the deaths of the 10 hunger strikers secured quite substantial freedoms within the HBlocks. So it's very interesting. So that essentially it's a prison struggle that was won. And these included the acknowledgement of membership of collective organisations, so the IRA and the Ulster Volunteer Force, the Irish National Liberation Army. So there was a recognition of political affiliations within the jail. And eventually, though wings were controlled by prisoner organisations, so from 81 until the closing of the jail, is that there was autonomy within each of the blocks. So they would be, IRA prisoners would essentially be in control of the daily life of prisoners. So they wouldn't work, they wouldn't wear prison uniform, and the day could be spent, for example, quite famously, there was a Republican Prisons Library, and so left-wing and national liberation movements sent in books, and there was their own education programme. So it was a jail that had an infrastructure of containment, but within that a high degree of political freedom within the jail. And so the material culture that relates to the prison that is now on sale on eBay relates exactly to those conditions of, well, strange conditions of a political jail and freedom within a jail. That history has not translated easily into debates around preservation of the site itself, and so some of that is summarised by a Guardian article some years ago in 2004 that says Maze keeps Ulster divided, and then the Guardian newspaper looks at the way in which the past, and this prison in particular, has become one of 3 key issues that underlay a breakdown of power sharing in Stormont between Sinn Féin and the Democratic Unionist Party 2 years ago. So policing was the other key issue, but the past was noted as an issue of disagreement. So immediately following the release of prisoners from Long-Kesh Maze under the Good Friday Agreement, so 20 years ago, there was actually much more optimism about how to create shared spaces in this prison site. There was a public consultation that attempted to balance the hopes and fears about the site, so a demand from Republicans for the most part to preserve the prison, and from Unionists on the other hand to have it razed to the ground. And there were plans for a multi-sports stadium, and there was plans for a conflict transformation centre. And these arose from a public consultation and an all-party working group. The International Conflict, so we could probably hold on this a little bit longer. The International Conflict Resolution Centre attracted some millions of European money and the interest of architect Daniel Libeskind. But the plans have halted and perhaps even ended. So this complex site of containment. The wall which we're looking at here, most of which is demolished, it was 2.5 miles long, and inside there was a system of internal walls, sterile and inert spaces, watchtowers, H-block yards, most of which became demolished in 2006 to make way for a development, the planned development that we looked at, but has yet to happen. And only a handful of structures remain: one compound, administration buildings, the hospital, and one H-block. So it is the demolition that makes the sale of the keys, the subject of this paper, possible. So the decommissioning of Kesh Maze and its whole paraphernalia of containment began of a process of removing property and shifting piles of prison artefacts. So even the compounds, which we looked at earlier, which have been disused for some 15 years, things had been abandoned or not thrown away. And there was, for example, a billboard, this is inside the administration buildings, that had been left until demolition, just simply not wiped clean. So this process was 2006. And when I took this photograph in 2010, it has the last, in 2002, it has the numbers of the last prisoners, which was still left without being wiped away. So this clearing out of cells, or partial clearing out of cells, would have been a regular practice during the lifetime of the prison. As prisoners left, their cells would have been cleaned up and made ready for others, but that process was extended through the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement. So wings and blocks were cleared, and then they become unoccupied. The cells were dismantled, and the furnishings taken out and sometimes reused within the prison system. And then collectors, archivists and looters came and went before these bulldozers in fact arrived. So there was a period where the prison was empty and slowly objects were removed, and some of them have ended up in the prison, in the Public Record Office in Northern Ireland, but some of them have found their way onto second-hand markets. So eBay auctions are directly connected to the destruction of the prison and the dispersal of its material record. So very large structures of conflict, and often the largest are those of British military occupations, such as Kesh Maze, have often been removed from view, and prohibited or limited access is only available at these sites. So this avoidance of the past, involvement, denial and attachment is articulated on the one hand through political dialogue about the prison and its past, but also on the other through everyday exchanges of prison artefacts that belong to the past. And the very hesitant and faltering political debate about the demolished prison has been accompanied by a bustling trade in its material culture, and it exposes a rather telling contradiction. The silence and fear that surrounds the prison site within political discourse has its antithesis in a popular practice of second-hand commodity exchanges. So there's an alternative register of interest in the past that's found on eBay and in these material transactions of artefacts. So we should have a look at them. So listed on eBay are prison officer tie-pins, postcards commemorating funds for Republican prisoners and their families, posters commemorating the 25th anniversary of the hunger strikes, copies of photographs of funerals of hunger strikers, wooden harps, which we can see here, Celtic crosses, handkerchiefs, the slide has squashed that, handkerchiefs made by Republicans and Loyalist prisoners, banners, leather wallets, bags sewn and embossed by prison workshops, and some original pamphlets of at the time. There are also a kind of histories, objects which are made or created for sale as well. So DVD recordings, vinyl recordings of rebel songs. So all these forms of material culture, both commemorative and historical, are available to the highest bidder almost all of the time. And their forms vary in financial value from just a few pounds to hundreds of pounds, or quite unusually in the sale of the keys to HBlocks, to thousands. And they're not auctioned really for either their use or beauty. They're not really auctioned for their sense of their form, but actually I'd say for something like their historical content or their historical narrative or their relationships. So my consideration of this trade in artefacts of political imprisonment developed from, there was actually a year-long survey of the material the material culture of Long Kesh Maze. So I put in search names into eBay, and I watched as things as came up, and so it generated a huge body of data from which I kind of traced and mapped the movements. However, having done that rather interesting methodological work, I actually think that working as an eBay browser tells you just as much. And so today I looked at what was on sale just today on the US eBay. So it says 472 results for Irish hunger strikes. And I know that towards the end of that there'll be some that won't relate necessarily to the 80s or 81. And here are just some of the things that you could buy today. Or not, actually, they might have gone already, but so here we go. So we have Bobby Sands and a Bobby Sands t-shirt. So at any one time, you could click on eBay and what pops up is this kind of proliferation of material culture. So eBay objects are all allocated a place in one of the 5 categories. So eBay has collectibles, art, clothes, shoes, accessories, books, comics and magazines, DVD, film and TV. But actually none of those categories easily lend themselves to an understanding of the material culture of Long Kesh Maze. So separating these things on the basis of domestic purpose, distinguishing objects of prison life as art, because they might go on a mantelpiece, or an item of dress that could be found in clothes. What that does is sort of privilege use over meaning, or content over the artefact. And I would say that historical content is an odd phrase, I think, which I can't find a better one at the moment for an object, but the sort of historical content of objects I'd like to consider as quite significant, at least in the way in which it works for my analysis of prison artefacts. So, and much more important than its use. So it's to do with something about the object's connection with history seems to matter more than anything like its purpose. So artefacts relating to the Republican prison experience in particular, in fact far more than a loyalist experience, and artefacts that relate to the 1981 hunger strikes and then also to Bobby Sands, dominate the trade in the material culture of Long Kesh Maze. So the dominant narrative, the one of Irish freedom through Republicans on hunger strike, that dominant narrative becomes reproduced in second-hand markets. So, for example, if we just took the searches today, these are the objects which come up more and more, rather than those that are necessarily associated with the prison officer's experience, for example. So these objects, newly reproduced T-shirts, hoodies, posters, DVDs, they all display moments in the history of the jail, but they actually have no physical relationship to the jail itself. So they're dependent on textile and photographic copy technologies that in fact didn't really exist at the time of the jail. And in fact, the reproduced image was something that was prohibited, so cameras were prohibited. So some of these objects have almost no connection apart from the narrative that they embody. And these objects take up, obviously, the most recognisable commodity form, the copy. And the unique occasion of a death, so the death of Bobby Sands, kind of echoes through the forms of mass-produced high streets goods, so they're on T-shirts and on hoodies. And none of this means, I think, that they can't be considered part of the material culture of Long Kesh. Commodity culture is a material culture, and everything auctioned on eBay is a commodity, but simply that I might want to categorise these not necessarily as clothing, but as commemorative. So I think they might be better to have some sense of their relationship to history as how we designate them. Now, many of the artefacts of 20th century political imprisonment are actually very typical of second-hand markets. So if we take the tie pins, these were worn by prison officers who worked in Long Kesh Maze, and they are regularly auctioned on eBay. And these are very discreet announcements of the affiliations to the Northern Ireland Prison Service and a period of working at Long Kesh Maze. And these items are most frequently captured by the search terms maze rather than long kesh. So maze as the official title is the one where you would call up a kind of prison officer experience. Such pins and tie tacks are actually very typical of military memorabilia, and on eBay, as on other collectors' sites, they're bought and sold amongst buttons, cufflinks, badges, medals, emblems of life in uniform. And here, for example, Maze Prison, 1978 to 2000, and dogs, which I'm assuming this is because somebody worked looking after the dogs, is where they've been listed several times by eBay sellers. So in my survey, Pimp My Dog tags, for example, was a seller over and over of these kinds of things, and they indicate maybe that this is part of a larger collection of duplicates, and that there is what's going on is a dealing in military memorabilia. For example, so Pimp My Dog tag says, please see my other listings for more great tie pins. And these pins commemorate in the abbreviated codes characteristic of badges, and also codes that are intended to limit complete recognition outside of a particular group, so you can wear them and only somebody else in the group would necessarily know what you're wearing. So the prison officer's role in the conflict could be announced, but announced discreetly. And the design of these is based again on this very familiar H shape and this shape of the cell units of Long Kesh maze. Another one uses a slightly different attachment. So we've got pest control unit, which is clearly a kind of play on the role of a prison officer, and the skull and crossbones as the batons and the helmet of a uniformed officer. However, the fact that these are a type of thing, a military badge, could outweigh the importance as the historical reference for a bidder. So I'm kind of arguing that it's not necessarily the fact that they're born to wear, they're born because they're bought because they have a commemorative function. So the copies, so the Long Kesh hoodies and these military badges or these kind of tie pins, I'd say actually do share some characteristics. They're duplicates and they're commemorative of a particular moment in time. So I think it may be useful to have this sense of the commemorative material culture of Long Kesh as significantly different from its historical matter. So on eBay, the commemorative objects are actually distinguished by price. They tend to be much cheaper. And historical objects, things that actually of the time and place of Long Kesh, are more highly prized and they cost more money. So, for example, on September the 5th, 2010, there was a 70s Ulster Volunteers POW, prisoner of war, leather wallet Long Kesh, and it sold for £46. And there is a reconstruction here of it says rare Irish Republican Long Kesh HBlock cottage, and it fetched £30 on the 20th of November. This was just kind of, that was in 2010. And then the same item was reissued again. And it's not clear to me whether this is in fact a copy or whether or not it's just being resold. So leather goods and wooden decorative pieces are actually recurring forms of Long Kesh maze prison art, and their material composition relates to the workshop curriculum of the jail. So leather and wood workshops were part of the prison rehabilitation programs, and they're intended to encourage prisoners to spend time productively, to learn the value of work, to foster self-esteem through the acquisition of skills. Artifacts made by prisoners were expressions of their personal achievement, demonstrations of perseverance, acquired both in terms of serving their prison sentence, but also in terms of learning the dexterity to create a crafted shape. However, the precise forms of prisoners' wooden and leather artefacts were actually not signs of rehabilitation into another way of life, but they vaunted their continued adherence to political or communal values for which they were in prison. So harps, Bernadette crosses, Celtic interlacing, Easter lilies, the starry plough, the tricolour, all of these were motives of Republican art, and loyalists often worked on iconography that's associated with that of Ulster and particularly the Red Hand. So prison art of Lancashire appropriated techniques and materials of penal workshops to reproduce artefacts that were simultaneously personal and political. So prisoners used skills acquired through the programme of rehabilitation to demonstrate resistance to rehabilitation within the jail itself. Chris Brown, who is the author of a very extensive Healing Through Remembering Artefacts audit, and Michelle, you mentioned Healing Through Remembering it in the introduction, and he talks about prison artefacts being one of the most common of the artefacts of the conflict. So he says they're ubiquitous. However, they still do hold kind of a fairly high historical value. Firstly, any artefact produced using workshop techniques, decorated wooden or leather objects, is historically unique because it's handmade. So there is a connection between the person who made it that's visible and tangible in either carved or stitched forms. So all of these forms, there is some relationship to the person that's evident. So prison art is evidence of intentions and actions of the prisoner who created it, a material manifestation of his agency expressed in the selection of shapes and the manipulation of surfaces. Such an artefact can embody the person and carries with them the moment of imprisonment and resistance from the past into the present. However, of higher value than the historical artefact is the archaeological. The highest prices on eBay are reserved for parts of the prison structure itself. So occasionally are listed these parts and objects that are salvaged, taken or stolen from the jail itself, such as the keys at £3,500. So Big Balls from the Falls, he offers an account of the archaeological authenticity to make his argument for the high financial value of the keys. So he says, this is just a snapshot from his account, but he says that they're acquired along with other forms by a consortium of historians and collectors from the demolition people. And then he further wrote that the prison, and here he says, the prison was paramount in the political strife in the north of Ireland throughout the late 20th century. It will be forever remembered for such things as the 1981 hunger strikes by Bobby Sands, in which 10 Republican prisoners died, and the 1983 breakout, in which 38 Republicans broke free. So I would suggest that this is an act of commodification for the second-hand market. It's spinning a story around an object on eBay at the same time as asserting rights with actually very little foundation of the seller who owns what he sells. So I'd say this is a kind of an imagining of the meanings of the keys. But I think commodification is only really the beginning of the story rather than the end of the story of these keys. Keys are associated, I'll take you back here. Keys are associated with both the prison and prisoners. So Big Balls from the Falls tells us that the keys are associated with Bobby Sands, the hunger strikers and the escapees. So he's trying to attach the keys to both the place and the person. So I would suggest in some ways that these keys are belongings. They are compressions of space and time, both human and material, that make these very mundane things very valuable, so they belong to the jail. And this extraordinary character, so compression of time and space, or notion that objects could belong to the past or belong to a place, is actually just completely typical of an archaeological object. It's just a bundle of the past in the present. So, Big Balls from the Falls, the macho avatar that positions the seller firmly in the nationalist Republican community and at the site of the prison, is probably a little bit misleading. So he didn't really deal with the demolition people. He might have done, I don't know. But these keys were placed, before they were placed on eBay, were listed for sale for from 3,000 to 5,000 euros. At White's auction house in Dublin on the 23rd of April 2010. So they appeared on eBay after this sale. So they were lot 30, and you can see they're the same. I mean, they're a little bit tidier and better photographed, but they are the same keys. And they were auctioned at the same time as the cameras. So if you look over the page to the side, there's the camera on the right and the keys are on the left. And so White's auction house had already put these up for sale, and in their text, which you can't read, it's too blurry, but they describe the keys in a little bit more detail. So the keys have stamped on them H6 D-wing catwalk, or H6 movement control, H2 inner grille, and the text goes on to say there's these circular brass keys that have red book prisoners, which were high security risks and usually escapees or those considered dangerous to prison staff and security forces. So the provenancing is also describing the kind of special nature of the keys themselves. And then White's Auction House says it's a fascinating and unique collection of artefacts from a challenging chapter in Ireland's history. Fantastic. So I could say something about how provenance, which is probably quite hastily written to meet the auction deadline, becomes kind of historical evidence quite quickly. And for example, red book prisoners were high security, but they weren't necessarily violent or flight risks. In fact, they were the part of the IRA command structure within the jail, and they moved around in order to unsettle prisoners rather than necessarily because they were going to escape. So there's some slight kind of shifting of the terms in the way in which the objects are provenanced. That's not really the point I want to make here. The point I want to try and make is around the question of belonging. So what appears with the eBay sale to be a Republican or a nationalist dealing in his own history is actually quite complicated. So the keys have already been auctioned, and then they're back on eBay, and then they have this description, which I've described as this process of kind of commodification, spinning of a story. So it's that I want to unpack a little bit as I conclude my paper. So eBay traders, they range from people who are looking for somewhere to sell inheritances, so a belonging, to established auctioneers, and everybody trades under the same kind of name. So it has this. So there's a sort of flatscape of difference that goes on eBay. Because there's easy access to the market, it's open anytime, any place to anybody to set up an internet account. It's flatlined all these different kinds of ownership into indistinguishable screen identities. So different forms of ownership and relationships to the past just simply collapse into one another. Now, there is a contradiction with all auctions, internet or otherwise, and all sales of previously owned goods is the object being disposed of has to be at the same time deemed to be worthy of keeping, otherwise it has no market value. So the selling of material culture of Long Kesh is no exception. These artefacts have to be put on sale at the same time as they should be kept. So there's a blurring, I think, of distinctions between collecting and dealing, keeping and selling, and preserving and divesting. And to exchange in order to withhold from exchange is typical of a wider material culture. Annette Viner calls it a kind of inalienable culture, is that we exchange things only in order to keep the best things for ourselves. So we're forever exchanging in order to actually keep. So, to whom do the keys belong? Who's the inheritor? Who's the collector? Who really owns the past in this sense, and who's merely dealing with it? The keys also, they appear as Republican. So they're sold by a Republican, and they appear part of a Republican history of HBlocks struggles. But they are hardly a Republican artefact. They're parts of a system of incarceration, elements of an architecture of cells, airlock gates, components of a system designed to contain and control prisoners. The hands that held these would have been prison officers, and they are all drawn, and the prison officers were drawn almost entirely from the unionist community. So on the face of it, they represent the HBlocks of Long Kesh by the key. It holds the permission to be inside, to go outside, and the denial of both those things. So there's a sort of social arrangement, according to Latour, that hangs upon the key. And he says, shall we say, that the social relationships between tenants and old owners, inhabitants and thieves, inhabitants and delivery people, are mediated by the key, the lock, and the locksmith? And he answers no. He insists that the key is no mere intermediary. It doesn't only carry those actions to and across his network. He argues that it doesn't simply express, or symbolise or reflect or objectify those relationships. He says the key is part of them, that they form and make them. So the keys of the HBlocks then, they're part of the fabric of the prism, called Kesh, known as the maze, and they're an archaeological bundle of space and time, and they are also of its experience of autonomy within our incarceration. So they are of repression and resistance, and maybe no wonder that they have such a high price. Thank you. I feel I should apologise for the quality of the images. As you can tell, most of them are drawn from internet sites, and so they are blurry, but it would be nicer to have, through the images to see everything more clearly, but such things don't quite exist.
The floor is open to questions.
Do you think fights broke out when the guys were, the Loyalists and the Republicans were in the workshop together doing their different motifs?
They didn't. There was only really one moment where Loyalists and Republicans were on the same wing. So just after the hunger strikes, and when people who had been on the blanket were then meant to be integrated, there were conflicts. And so one of the determining factors for how the jail was run was the separation of communities, so that wings would be reserved for the IRA and wings would be reserved for the Irish National Liberation Army, as they would for the UDA. And so that separation of communities allowed them, they're kind of part of their autonomy. And so one of the demands was the freedom to associate, but only to associate within people's own communities. So I would say rather like some of the Supermax prisons that you have here, where communities are separated according to gang membership, because you couldn't run a prison if everybody's at war. And so one of the issues around the HBlocks is actually kind of interesting around Supermax prisons, is that the development of those structures are to do with discipline within the jail rather than fear of what happens when people come in and outside. So prisons are quite interesting structures that develop according to problems of order within them rather than just order on the outside. So there weren't fights because they were literally in different blocks.
Are there any legal issues with having?
Well, I think it's a really good question, because I think a lot about objects that are in museums, which were taken on British Army raids, so handkerchiefs or even weapons sometimes, or books and pamphlets that were in British Army museums that are actually taken as loot, and these as well. So I think that kind of appropriation of war of objects and who owns them is really interesting. So I kind of think it would be quite good to have an exercise in working out what's cultural property. If you applied the term cultural property to contemporary conflicts, how would you then begin to resolve and think about what who owns them and so on? But I think there are probably legal issues, to be honest, about who they belong to, I would say. There were lots of very odd auctions. The Guardian reported on an odd auction when the prison was in limbo, where they said, we're selling pots and pans from the kitchen and so on. And I think some of these objects were probably in these very informal on-site auctions. But yeah, so I think they are probably, we should investigate.
This is a narrow question, so apologies.
Oh, that's okay.
I actually worked at the Irish newspaper in the 1980s.
Oh, okay.
It's one of my
Fantastic.
first jobs after college, and so I was working there in sort of 83, 84, anyway, when the hunger strikes had just happened, and the families were coming over, and it was a very active topic of debate. And the image that sticks in my mind of that time is the wire.
Yes.
The bar, even before the TV shows, the barbed wire. And I was wondering if any of that has come up and how that's affected, because it also is, for me, very, kind of the entwined with Catholicism and the Crown of Thorns
Yeah.
Just how you often saw
So
it.
here you have it in. It's not. I should have altered the image so you could see that it's a handkerchief, but you couldn't read the writing. So I think barbed wire occurs. There's lots and lots of these particular objects. So handkerchiefs were smuggled in and out of the jail. So you can see the folds on the hanky. Can you see?
Yeah.
So it's probably spent much of its time folded up, and they were worked in prisoners' own cells. And this is just felt tip, so it was felt tip work. And there were some people who drew stencils, who shared their stencils or didn't share their stencils with other people. And these were smuggled out and then used to raise money. So wire occurs over and over. There's a very famous song that's related to the Long Kesh cases, so Men Behind the Wire.
Yeah,
So it was,
Harvard Cars and
yeah,
things
so
like that,
so yeah, it occurs many times as a motif. Yeah, and some of the motifs are over and over. The flag, the weapon, the wire. These things are kind of, you know. And in fact, is it on this one here as well?
Are some of those fakes, or do you think?
I think so, probably. And can you see it here as well around the H block? Yeah. So yes, yeah, and yeah, it is an important motif over. Yeah, I'm not, yeah, I don't. It would be. You could do archaeological testing, I suppose, the same as the legal questions you could work out. But I think some objects they're in small batch production for the commemorative market, I'd say, unfortunately. So.
How did you get interested in this topic?
It's a very good question. I was in Belfast in 2000. There's a very big festival called Fianna Fáil, the People's Festival, and somebody said, "Louise, you do some work on museums. They want to build a museum at Long Kesh." And I'd done a little bits and pieces of work around iconography, and so I became involved with debates about preservation. And I documented the jail with a photographer in 2000. So I was one of the few people that got in to see it when it was still intact but empty. So it was in this kind of state of limbo. So so it was that kind of clashing together of the possibility of preservation and the interest in everyday objects and how. So this is how. Yeah. So on and off, I've mapped its transformation for about 20 years.
But actually, I was going to ask, well, two questions. One is, was there any sort of, documentation has there been any documentation of the demolition of the prison by the government? And also, I wasn't, the sale of the keys at, was it White's auction?
The White's auction house in Dublin, yeah.
So those are the same keys that then show up on eBay?
Yes.
So are you saying that they were purchased by somebody at White's auction and then they show up on eBay, or did they not sell at White's auction? Were they bought
I think
or were they actually sold at White's and then that person puts them on eBay?
I think that's exactly what happened because of the timing of it. So if we looked at the pictures, so there are these. I have looked at them and gone through them, and they're the same keys, they're just differently arranged, although I think there is possibly, so this one is, so there's these, the paper tags you can see here, and then you can see the Yale keys, and then I counted the number of fobs on here at one time, so I think they are the same. But they're not the whole keys to the HBlocks, because there are 8 HBlocks, and where's H1's keys, and you know, where's the big key to the big, so, anyway, they're kind of a fiction, aren't they, because they're not the whole of the keys, they're just, in some respects, I'm pretty sure these are the real things. But, so there are military collectors, and they have quite a lot of money. There was a rumour that one of them had bought an entire watchtower. So there are military collectors, and some of it, I think that possibly these were bought and they were sold to a military collector, I could probably find out. I haven't actually had any answers, partly because I do think there are some legal issues when I've asked around about these. Yeah.
I'd be interested in what you think about the way these kinds of material remainders get monetized according to sort of how distant in time, and also the duration of their important moment. For example, we're 100 years on from the sinking of the Titanic. It was one spectacular moment. This is viewed with martyrdom that went on for decades, and it's living memory. So I wonder if you would comment about duration, time, distance, and monetizing.
Yeah, I think the monetizing, I was trying to get at that in the paper a little bit, I suppose at one level, really crudely, there's a kind of celebrity culture, isn't there? Is the closer to the person, the more expensive an object can be if that person is well known. So, I mean, Bobby Sands was in H6 at one time, but he was moved around and lots of people were. So you could kind of go, oh, one of the keys was a key that locked up Bobby Sands. You could kind of, but maybe it's not, or maybe it was, you know, Yale keys are made all the time, and these would be keys from the 1990s. But so the closer it can get to somebody that is famous or in even known history, the higher in value it becomes. And so that seems a really unkind way of talking about a martyr, doesn't it, really, in lots of ways. So it might be another way would be to talk about relics and the ways in which relics are which is what I was trying to do, is hold together a sense of these things belonging to somebody in a place, as well as having a kind of commodity status at the same time. And they're both those things, aren't they? They're both commodities and objects of value and significance.
Especially if there's a note of sacred about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And unfortunately, that is exploited by people who go into batch production for making, you know, hoodies and, you know, all the rest of it. So I think that that occurs not just around the hunger strikes and not just around this jail, but around all, like you say, all of those kind of moments in time that people feel an attachment to. And one of the things I'm interested in is a little bit like that, what you were saying about working on a paper in 1983. It's about how we operate as witnesses to history, even though we're distant. And so around the hunger strikes, I'm interested in the way in which people listened. They could be miles away, and often people were still listening to radio as they woke up in the morning, and the radio would announce, and Bobby Sands has refused breakfast this morning, it's his 14th day on hunger strike, and that would be heard in New York, and it would be heard in Dublin, and it would be heard in London, and it would be heard in Belfast. And so there's something about that collective secondary witnessing, or ethical witnessing, Edward Said sometimes taught, where we're involved in something even though we're distant. And I think in that is part of, unfortunately, why things are so highly valued financially, because they seem to be part of that experience that we want to hold on to. Yeah. And it's why, in some ways, if you had a jail that was preserved, I wouldn't really be talking about this. I might be talking about objects which were in the jail and free and open to everybody. So because of the prohibitions around the jail, I think that some of the monetisation have taken over a popular practice of heritage where people can't visit the site. I think there is this sort of relationship between private collecting in the absence of a more public history that goes on. Does that help as an answer?
I was curious, I think you touched on it a little bit in your paper, and forgive me, I don't know too much about the political leanings and the divisions of different groups, but has your work, have you reflected on current political parties and Sinn Féin and the different nuances in politics that have currently been established, and how activities like this might fuel it? I know that's a little speculative, but I'm just wondering how a collective like this could shape current political discourse.
It does, because it does. My argument is that the past is available in these objects. So the past, and that's their archaeological or their historical forces, that they bring the past into the space in which we're sitting, like we were talking about it. So they do have that power. And what you're asking is actually quite complicated in some ways, because the division. The current divisions in power sharing, and they are breaking down at the moment. Right. there's an election called, and which will elect probably the same people, so Arlene Foster from DUP and Martin McGuinness from Sinn Féin, as both the kind of to occupy the First Minister and Deputy First Minister positions. And they've had different relationships to the peace process, really. So a Republican perspective would be often around commemorating the past and remembering it, and seeking to develop tourism along the Falls Road in terms of the black taxi visits, and arguing for, particularly for this site, to be kept open. And the unionist perspective has been one that actually history of terrorism should not be celebrated, and it would be better to say nothing. So there is a kind of, you could see it as a crude division between remembering and forgetting, or between seeking to tell a history, one which is a history that fits into a liberation narrative. So Republicans were incarcerated, the hunger strikes brought about Sinn Féin as a political party, which it did. There was a mass movement for a political party, and that political party took the messages of peace then into the peace process. So there's a sort of narrative of freedom. And the unionist one is not. It's actually one of failure, because in fact it's one where it was a sense of trying to hold on to against Republican demands to a kind of status quo. So it's one that's kind of just keeping hold of power, rather than, so maybe failure is too strong, but it's a sort of in stasis. So you can see that gets manifested around his politics of remembering, and then also around material culture as well. So it's very difficult, and there's not a great deal on display. So in the Ulster Museum, there's very little material culture on display.
What is on display?
Lots of photographs. So these huge, I don't know if people have been to Ulster Museum. Maybe is that they've got in the Troubles Gallery is they've got the kind of archetypal gable end with a series of black and white photographs and lots of text. It's a fantastic exhibition, because as you move in, you get to see lots and lots of different perspectives all at once. So it's kind of interesting story, but not very many objects. And the group that I work with, Healing Through Remembering, we used the artifacts audit that I mentioned very briefly, so compiled by Chris Brown, to produce a travelling exhibition where the emphasis was on objects. So it was on pulling together objects that represented different political positions. So shrapnel from inside somebody's leg from an IRA bomb, so literally taken out, it was actually a very large bedsheet rather than a handkerchief that was produced by loyalists in jail. So we tried to put together objects which told different stories and didn't try and resolve them, didn't try and make them tell the same story or play into the narrative of remembering versus forgetting. It was just to try and, let those stories exist in the same space rather than sort of force them together. So yeah, it is complicated, indeed, yeah.
Kind of and I don't know if it's a question, it's sort of an unformed thought, but I think this question, obviously it's really thought-provoking, and I feel like it's sort of for somebody who, it makes me feel like I work on very safe things. Very risk-free things.
There's a risk to everything.
I hope so, or not, I don't know. But I'm thinking about this concept of indexicality. It's always been really fascinating to me, and I think this project makes me think about a kind of irony around indexicality, that it's almost as though in some ways it depends largely on faith or belief. That one would, sort of the definition of it, one would think the opposite, that it's about, okay, I was here on the photograph, but you cannot dispute this because you're seeing this, we're like, I'm touching the wound, But I feel as though so many things that you've shown, either they require some sort of context, some sort of display, some sort of explanation, or they're such mundane things that in some way we have to just go with it, right? We have to just say yes. Or when you're talking about the keys, that they're not all the keys, they're just some keys.
Exactly.
And I wonder if you've come up against that at all. And as I say, I'm not quite sort of German. No. I thought,
Yeah, I think so. What my reference to indexicality was the way in which Alfred Gell uses it in Art and Agency, and I think what he says some really interesting things is that what he argues is that if you were talking about art, is the index is to the person who made it, so it's their congealed performance of making. So you could. I mean, these are not very good images, like I say. But if I find one that where you can make it work for, this probably is the easiest. So you could, in terms of kind of congealed performances, there's a time and a place, and you could see in the image that somebody has marked it out with felt tip pen, so the object indexes the act of its making, and we know that because we know from crafted objects that we read very quickly back to the moment of production, don't we? We see them and we can see what's going on the surface. So there's one sense in which the index doesn't have to look like the person who made it. We just simply have to see the signs of the hand on the object, which is really different from the way Charles Peirce uses index, because index is meant to have some kind of relationship, formal relationship, rather than one where we see the maker in an object that doesn't look like the maker, and we're not saying. So I think that's quite interesting, is this kind of sense that you can see the act of making in the object that is made. And the other thing that he goes on to argue is that there often is some kind of human resemblance. I mean, there isn't in the keys. The keys are too manufactured. You can't really see a great deal of humanity in them, I don't think, can you? I wouldn't say. Well, I've got so many images, I'm not to stumble across them soon. Where have they gone? Where have they gone? And that's, but they are really, I mean, they are complicated objects because they do have the kind of symbolism of incarceration associated with the key, but they don't have that kind of sense of the maker in them, I don't think.
I think whoever buys those is haunted.
Well,
right?
yeah, absolutely.
But they're rusted.
Yeah.
I mean, they're used.
Yeah.
I mean, there's.
You could say haunted, and
aspect
also you could say contaminated, because I do think some of the objects, once they've been part of, you can't shake off history. History doesn't go away. You can't pretend it didn't happen, and so there's that sense of ghostliness about these things.
Yeah, I want to discuss when you mentioned Bruno Latour's.
Yes.
I think that what he's trying to say about objects is that they have agency. They are actors of the social.
Yeah.
And I think it's very complicated because he's putting, all possible social actors in a horizontal place. And I do think that objects do need a lot of help in order for other social actors, let's say humans, to make questions to them. I mean, these keys they need a lot of context depending on the place you are putting them. I mean, I'm thinking, bring these keys to my country, Colombia, they don't know the language, and you put them somewhere else, let's say in the kitchen for my grandmother, and they will have no idea what those are. They need a lot of help. These objects need a narrative. They need the person on eBay just creating a narrative to sell them. They need the gallery. You need to know where they come from, that they have moved from this place in order to have this indexicality. So, do you think objects have agency?
Oh yeah, for sure. I do. I mean, I think that these keys do, in the sense that if you took Latour's analysis of them, is that the key requires a door. So one of the relationship in it would be the key would require a door, and so already you're beginning to produce the key as part of a network. That there is a door, and then the reason there's a door is that there's somebody who's going to lock it and open it and have control. So the key is, in the absence of the prism, evokes the network. So any one part, so that's the index, I suppose, is any one part of the network could evoke the rest of the network. So when we see the keys, if we know enough, and if we know enough about the H, that you could begin to put that together in terms of, so in terms of reconstructing or reconfiguring the history. So the object has agency both in its power to evoke, but also its place within the system. I mean, what's really curious about these keys is that after 1994, prisoners won all kinds of freedoms, but 1994 prisoners used the World Cup. I think it was a World Cup in 1994, and they had matches on in the middle of the night, so it must have been time difference and all the rest of it. So they said, oh, don't lock ourselves at night. And so once they'd agreed to let people watch the football because that keeps everybody happy and all the rest of it, then doors were unlocked, and then they were unlocked all the time from 94 until 2000. So I don't know who had these keys, but no one was locking any doors. They were locking doors at the beginning of at the top of the wings, but not the cell doors. So they are, I mean, they do need context, but they still can evoke and reproduce or suggest, if in its mildest term, the prison. And, you have to know something, but you have to understand the network, I suppose, to understand those places in it.
I would go even back farther.
Okay.
No, just to say that, it's a key and it's a designed
Yes.
and made object. Right?
Yeah.
So it does begin
Yeah.
in the mind
Yeah.
of someone who
Yeah.
wants to develop a key in the
Yeah.
lock. I mean,
Yes.
so there's where the human.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I agree that these things, you would see the human hand. I mean, I think they're handwritten.
Yes, they are, yeah, yeah. And they're hand stamped as well.
I agree that, it's like the keys at the very bottom.
Yeah.
I mean, when I looked at them, it's a strange thing. They reminded me of my father's keys
Yeah.
to his car.
Yeah.
Or something. I don't know, they just like reminded me of my father. So that, as a curator, which is what I am, these are all the things that you sort of have to sort through.
Yes.
Which stories do you tell and how.
Yeah.
But also acknowledging that every person who comes to look at that object will have an association that has perhaps nothing at all, like I just had, to do with the story that you want to tell.
Yeah.
So it's such a complicated.
I mean, and one of the things they are, and I do think that so keys, and this would be a kind of Latourian thing, is keys presuppose separate kind of spaces, don't they? So they presuppose separation as a system or as part of a network. And so if you have a key, you can get in and out, and if you don't, you can't. And I'm not sure what it would be like to be locked up. I mean, all people in Kesh, they were all lifers, all of them, every single one of them. So the prison sentences that were dished out by the diplomat courts were almost always life sentences. So you have a jail full of people who are there for life. And some of that, and so I think that's extraordinary, an extraordinary way. So, yeah.
What came across to me as interesting amongst all these objects is that, so there were a few set of objects, if we look at the camera and the keys, which kind of symbolically represent confinement or restriction, which happened in the past. Whereas if we look at the handkerchief, the wallet, I mean, they to me seem like modes of expression or like objects where prisoners have expressed freedom within confinement.
Yeah.
I think I'm just curious about that.
Well, I think I don't know whether all prisons are like this, but there are kind of supreme systems of control. So I would say, and I've thought about prisons for quite a long time now, is that the most important system of control is a barrier, a harsh and brutal barrier. So it is that kind of act of separation. And so once you have that, the isolation of a community from another community, then you'll have other systems of surveillance within that. So, but the separation and surveillance are the basic components of a prison system. And even within that, there are forms of resistance, and they may be really, really, really small forms of resistance, and they often have softer fabric, so the materiality of resistance within the gel won't be concrete and metal, it will be fabric and torn blankets or wearing blankets. Prisoners used to, in Long Kesh maze, in the HBlocks, they would use a piece of string from the blanket and tie something to it, like maybe a bit of tobacco, and ping it under the floor to somebody else or swing it out of the line. So they got around the kind of harsh, brutal concrete and metal with these kind of more fluid mechanisms and handkerchiefs that are rolled up. And so there are kind of forms of resistance that have a counter materiality. And the other counter materiality is the voice. So all of these things, they kind of don't tell us loads about the way voices were used. There's something about the kind of metal clanging of the keys, and people talk about that. They also talk about the way in which prison officers smell differently, because they would have the outside smell of kind of aftershave, and so you'd know somebody was on the wing because the smell would be different. And Republican prisoners sang. So I think there's these kind of different forms of resistance within those very harsh forms, which I think are important to think about, really.
It was a wonderful talk. So thank you. I guess I'm struck particularly in this image by the fact that there's an absence of keys.
Yeah.
Right. So you have keys. We've been talking about keys, but then all of these fobs are the thing that actually gives the key then meaning, perhaps. And then I was thinking about how you were talking, of course, about the political tensions and that these men become heroic in a way that perhaps soldiers become heroic, and so then the fob is almost like a dog tag.
Yeah, it does look like dog tag.
Right, and so then I guess I was just curious then, what do you make of the absence of the key? You talk so much about the presence of a key, but then what do you make of the absence of the key in place where now you have a fob? And that takes on the meaning because that has the person's name inscribed. So if you wanted to get into sign signifier issues, then that's all there more than the inscription of the key or the fact that the key went to a door. Maybe it's too, but it just came up as I've heard it in other questions too, and so I just thought that I'd place it on the table for you.
Well, if I followed the argument about their archaeological status, most archaeology are fragments, aren't they? We work with fragments, and so in some respects it's not unusual that they're not complete. It's not, it's not they wouldn't matter. It's just that the condition of objects from sites, historic sites, conflict or otherwise, is often that they are fragmentary. And so one of the things I think if I go to this photo, so this is this absence. I mean, there are bits that you can see. You can see the buttons where there would have been a light. There's a kind of that black thing is a light switch. The door is gone, and you can see the footprint of the cell because they come. And in fact, the last time I went to the site, you can actually see the H's because you can see the footprints. So I think that the structure of the objects that contain the past is always that they are a ruin or a fragment or not entirely complete, because that's, time erodes things, time contingency erodes, and so we're left trying to piece it together, which is what this paper's doing really. It's trying to piece together the past in its forms. That's what we're all trying to do. So,
Thank you. I think we've probably exhausted you.
No, not at all. I could talk about
You get to Alcatraz.